The alarm buzzed at 4:30 in the morning, cutting through the darkness of Marcus Thompson's small flat in Windsor. He didn't need the alarm anymore. His body had learned to wake on its own after 6 years of this routine, but he kept it set anyway. Routine was everything in his world. Marcus swung his legs over the edge of the bed and sat for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the city still sleeping outside his window. At 28, he had already spent more than a fifth of his life in service to the crown. Some days that felt like a lifetime. Other days, like today, it felt like he was just getting started. The shower water was cold. It always was at this hour, but Marcus didn't mind. The shock helped wake him up completely, clearing away any lingering traces of sleep. He had learned early in his service that being a Queen's Guard meant being alert at all times. There was no room for drowsiness, no space for mistakes. Every day, thousands of tourists would stare at him, photograph him, and test his resolve. Every day, he had to be perfect. After drying off, Marcus stood before his bathroom mirror and began the meticulous process of preparing his appearance. His dark hair needed to be exactly regulation length, combed back without a single strand out of place. His face required a perfect shave, not just close but absolutely smooth. The standards were exacting, and Marcus had long ago internalized every detail. The uniform came next, each piece a masterwork of military precision. The red tunic, heavy and structured, had to be perfectly pressed. Marcus ran his hands over every inch, checking for wrinkles or spots that might have appeared overnight. The brass buttons needed to shine like mirrors, catching and reflecting light with mathematical precision. He polished each one individually, even though they had been perfect the night before. The white belt required special attention. It had to be spotless, aligned exactly, with every component in its proper place. Marcus adjusted and readjusted, using a ruler to ensure the spacing was correct. In 6 years of service, he had never once been marked down for uniform infractions. That record meant everything to him. The black boots came next, already polished to a mirror shine but requiring one final buffing. Marcus could see his reflection clearly in the leather. These boots had carried him through countless ceremonies, parades, and long days of standing guard. They were broken imperfectly, molded to his feet through thousands of hours of wear. Finally, came the bearskin hat, the 18-inch tall piece that transformed him from Marcus Thompson into one of the instantly recognizable symbols of British tradition. The hat was heavy, nearly 2 pounds of bear fur and internal structure that took time to position correctly. Marcus settled it on his head with practiced movements, adjusting the chin strap and ensuring the proper angle. The hat changed everything about how he moved and held himself. It demanded perfect posture, complete stillness, and unwavering dignity. By 6:30, Marcus was ready. He looked at himself in the full-length mirror one final time, checking every detail with the thoroughness that had become second nature. The man staring back at him was no longer Marcus Thompson, the working-class kid from Yorkshire who had joined the army to find direction in his life. This was a Queen's Guard, part of a tradition stretching back centuries, a living symbol of British history and values. The commute to Buckingham Palace took 40 minutes on the early morning tube. Marcus preferred this time of day, when the trains were mostly empty and he could sit quietly without drawing stares. Once the morning rush began, traveling in full uniform became a different experience entirely. People would point, whisper, and sometimes try to engage him in conversation. Marcus had learned to be politely distant during these interactions, maintaining the dignity of his role while still being human. As the train pulled into St. James's Park Station, Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his stomach that came before each day of duty. It wasn't nervousness exactly, but rather a heightening of awareness, a mental preparation for the hours ahead. Being a Queen's Guard required a special kind of mental toughness. Standing perfectly still for hours while thousands of strangers stared, photographed, and sometimes tried to provoke reactions was unlike any other job in the world. The walk through St. James's Park in the early morning was one of Marcus's favorite parts of each day. The park was peaceful at this hour, with only a few early joggers and dog walkers sharing the paths. The palace came into view gradually, its imposing facade growing larger with each step. No matter how many times he saw it, the sight still stirred something in Marcus. This was history made tangible, centuries of British heritage embodied in stone and tradition. At the palace, Marcus joined his fellow guards for the morning briefing. Today's posting would be at the main gates, one of the most visible and challenging positions. The main gates attracted the largest crowds, the most tourists, and, inevitably, the most people who seemed to think testing a guard's composure was entertaining. Sergeant Williams, a veteran with 15 years of service, conducted the briefing with his usual efficiency. Weather would be clear and warm, perfect conditions for large tourist crowds. Intelligence suggested no particular security concerns, no planned protests or unusual events. It would be, by all appearances, a routine day. "Remember, gentlemen," Sergeant Williams concluded, as he did every morning, "you represent more than yourselves out there. You represent the regiment, the army, and the crown. Every tourist who sees you today will form an impression of British military excellence based on your conduct. Make it count." Marcus nodded along with the others, but the words carried special weight for him today. Tonight, after his duty ended, he planned to meet Sarah at their favorite restaurant in Covent Garden. The engagement ring he had saved for months to buy was hidden in his civilian clothes, waiting for the right moment. Sarah knew he was serious about their relationship, but she didn't know how serious. The proposal he had been planning for weeks would change both their lives. The thought of Sarah made Marcus smile slightly, a brief crack in the perfect military bearing he maintained. They had met 2 years ago when she was working as a tour guide at the Tower of London. She understood his dedication to his service in ways that other girlfriends hadn't. Sarah never complained about the long hours, the rigid schedule, or the way his job demanded complete commitment. She seemed to find his dedication attractive rather than frustrating. As the morning progressed and the palace gates opened to tourists, Marcus took his position with practiced precision. His feet were positioned exactly shoulder-width apart, his posture perfectly straight despite the weight of his uniform and bearskin hat. His rifle was held at the precise angle required by regulation, every detail of his stance conforming to standards drilled into him through years of training. The first tourists began arriving around 9 o'clock, mostly organized tour groups with professional guides who knew to respect the guard's space and duties. These early visitors were typically older, more mature travelers who appreciated the historical significance of what they were witnessing. They took their photographs from appropriate distances and spoke in hushed, respectful tones. Marcus found these early hours relatively easy. His mind could wander slightly, thinking about Sarah, about their evening plans, about the life they might build together after his service ended. He had already served 6 years, with 4 more required to complete his full term. By then, he would be 32, still young enough to start a civilian career but old enough to have gained the discipline and maturity that military service provided. As the morning progressed into afternoon, the tourist crowds grew larger and more diverse. Families with children began arriving, excited kids pointing at the guards and asking endless questions. Why doesn't he move? Can he talk? What happens if I touch him? Marcus had heard these questions thousands of times, delivered in dozens of languages by curious visitors from around the world. The professional tour groups gave way to individual tourists, many carrying large cameras and smartphone gimbals, documenting every detail of their London experience. Marcus was photographed hundreds of times during a typical day, appearing in countless social media posts, family albums, and travel blogs. He had long ago made peace with being treated somewhat like a living monument rather than a person. By early afternoon, the crowd dynamics began to shift in ways Marcus recognized from experience. The tourists arriving now were often younger, more casual in their approach to the guards and the palace. Some had clearly been drinking at nearby pubs, treating their palace visit as entertainment rather than a cultural experience. These were the visitors who required more careful attention, the ones most likely to cross boundaries or test limits. Marcus noticed one group in particular, a collection of young people in their early 20s who seemed more interested in creating social media content than appreciating the historical significance of where they were. They moved with the casual confidence of people accustomed to being the center of attention, carrying professional-grade camera equipment and speaking loudly about getting the perfect shot. The leader of the group was immediately recognizable as someone who considered himself important. He was tall and athletically built, with carefully styled hair and clothing that probably cost more than Marcus earned in a month. Everything about his demeanor suggested someone accustomed to getting his way, to being the focus of attention wherever he went. This young man directed the others with casual authority, pointing out angles for photographs and discussing lighting conditions with the expertise of someone who made his living being looked at. Marcus had encountered similar types before, usually social media personalities or aspiring actors who saw the guards as props for their content rather than professional soldiers performing an important duty. The group spent considerable time positioning themselves for photographs, using the palace gates and guards as a backdrop for what appeared to be a professional photo shoot. They were technically within the bounds of acceptable behavior, staying behind the designated lines and not directly interfering with the guards' duties. However, something about their attitude suggested they might not remain content with simple photographs for long. Marcus maintained his perfect stillness while keeping these visitors in his peripheral vision. Experience had taught him to identify potential trouble before it fully developed. The body language of the group's leader, the way he gestured and spoke, suggested someone building up to something more dramatic than simple tourist photos. The afternoon heat was beginning to affect Marcus in small ways. The heavy uniform trapped body heat, and the tall bearskin hat made temperature regulation even more challenging. Sweat collected along his hairline and between his shoulder blades, but he couldn't acknowledge it in any way. Moving to wipe sweat or adjust his position would be a breach of protocol, a sign of weakness that could undermine the entire carefully maintained image. Standing motionless for hours required a specific kind of mental discipline. Marcus had learned to enter an almost meditative state, aware of everything around him but not reactive to minor discomforts or distractions. His mind could process the constant stream of tourists, conversations, and activities while his body remained perfectly still. It was a skill that had taken years to develop and required constant practice to maintain. The group with the social media equipment was now the largest crowd in the immediate area around Marcus's position. Their leader had begun speaking more loudly, clearly performing for his companions and for the cameras they carried. Marcus couldn't make out all the words, but the tone was becoming more theatrical, more designed to draw attention and reactions. Other tourists were beginning to notice the group as well, some joining their crowd to see what was happening, others moving away from what they sensed might become a disruptive situation. Marcus had seen this dynamic many times before. One attention-seeking visitor could quickly attract others, creating a crowd mentality that often led to increasingly bold behavior. The palace security officers were also taking notice, Marcus observed. Two uniformed officers had positioned themselves with better views of the developing situation, ready to intervene if necessary. The presence of security was both reassuring and concerning. It meant professional help was available if needed, but it also suggested that the situation was being taken seriously by people trained to recognize potential problems. Marcus's radio, discreetly positioned in his ear, crackled with brief communications between security personnel. Code words and position updates that confirmed his suspicion that he and the growing crowd around him were now under closer observation. The situation hadn't crossed any lines yet, but it was definitely being monitored. The sun was now directly overhead, making the already warm day genuinely uncomfortable for anyone wearing a heavy military uniform. Marcus had learned techniques for managing the physical challenges of his role, but some days were simply more difficult than others. Today was becoming one of those days, with the combination of heat, large crowds, and a potentially problematic group of tourists creating perfect conditions for trouble. Sarah would be finishing her work at the Tower of London around now, probably thinking about their dinner plans and the quiet evening they had discussed. She had no idea about the engagement ring waiting in Marcus's flat, or about the carefully planned proposal he had been rehearsing for weeks. The contrast between his current situation and his evening plans felt almost surreal. The thought of Sarah helped Marcus maintain his focus and composure. Whatever happened during the remaining hours of his duty, he had something wonderful to look forward to. Their relationship had become the anchor that helped him through the most challenging aspects of his service. Knowing that someone understood and supported his dedication made the long days and rigid requirements easier to bear. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, Marcus prepared himself mentally for what he sensed would be the most challenging part of his day. The group with cameras was still present, still growing in size, and their leader was clearly building towards something more dramatic than simple photographs. Marcus had no way of knowing exactly what would happen, but his experience told him that the peaceful morning and early afternoon were about to give way to something much more demanding. The perfect day that had begun before dawn was about to become something else entirely, though Marcus couldn't yet imagine how dramatically his life was about to change. Jake Morrison checked his phone for the third time in 10 minutes, watching the numbers climb on his latest Instagram post. 2.3 million followers, and growing by the hour. At 25, he had built an empire out of his willingness to do what others wouldn't, to push boundaries that more cautious content creators avoided. His brand was built on bold stunts, outrageous challenges, and the kind of content that made people stop scrolling and pay attention. Today's London adventure was supposed to be different from his usual content. His management team had suggested something more cultural, more sophisticated than his typical pranks and challenges. London was full of history and tradition, perfect for showing his international audience a different side of his personality. The plan had been simple: tour the major landmarks, create some respectful content, and demonstrate that Jake Morrison could be more than just another American influencer causing chaos for views. But, walking through the streets of London, surrounded by centuries of history and tradition, Jake felt the familiar itch for something more exciting. His followers expected spectacle, and spectacle was what had made him famous. Playing it safe might be what his management wanted, but safe content didn't go viral. Safe content didn't generate the millions of views that translated into sponsorship deals and merchandise sales. His crew consisted of 3 professionals: Tommy with the main camera, Lisa handling lighting and backup footage, and Miguel managing sound and live streaming equipment. They had worked together for almost 2 years, long enough to develop an efficient system for capturing Jake's content in high quality while staying mobile enough to adapt to changing situations. The morning had been spent at Westminster Abbey and the Tower Bridge, creating the kind of conventional tourist content that Jake's management had requested. Beautiful shots of historic landmarks, thoughtful commentary about British culture, and the sort of respectful tourism content that brands loved to sponsor. It was well produced and professionally executed, but Jake could sense it lacked the energy that his audience craved. By early afternoon, the numbers on his live stream were starting to plateau. Comments were coming in asking when he would do something more exciting, when the real Jake would appear. His audience had been trained to expect constant escalation, each piece of content needing to be bigger and bolder than the last. Meeting those expectations had made him rich and famous, but it also created a pressure that never fully went away. When the crew reached Buckingham Palace, Jake felt the first real spark of inspiration he had experienced all day. The palace was impressive enough, but it was the guards that caught his attention. These weren't just tourist attractions, they were real soldiers, trained professionals who had dedicated their lives to an ancient tradition. More importantly, they were famous for never breaking character, never reacting to the thousands of tourists who photographed and stared at them every day. Jake had heard the stories and seen the videos. Queen's Guards were legendary for their discipline and composure. People tried constantly to make them laugh, flinch, or react in some way, but they remained perfectly still no matter what happened around them. It was a challenge that immediately appealed to Jake's competitive instincts and his audience's appetite for boundary-pushing content. The guard positioned at the main gate looked to be around Jake's age, perhaps a few years older. He was tall and perfectly postured, his red uniform immaculate and his bearskin hat positioned with mathematical precision. Everything about his appearance suggested years of training and absolute dedication to his role. To Jake, he looked like the perfect subject for the kind of content that would remind his audience why they followed him. Jake began by taking standard tourist photos, positioning himself and his crew for the best angles while Tommy captured establishing shots of the palace and guards. The lighting was perfect, the crowds provided good background energy, and the production value was exactly what his sponsors expected. But Jake's mind was already moving beyond simple documentation towards something more engaging. The live stream comments were becoming more insistent. Viewers were asking when Jake would do something cool with the guards, referencing videos they had seen of other content creators testing the guards' famous discipline. Jake found himself reading the comments aloud to his crew, building anticipation for what would come next while also psyching himself up for pushing the boundaries. Chat wants to see if these guards are as unshakable as everyone says, Jake announced to his camera, speaking directly to his audience with the casual intimacy that had made him successful. I mean, they look impressive, but are they really as disciplined as the legends suggest? There's only one way to find out. Tommy adjusted his camera angle to capture both Jake and the guard in the same shot, while Lisa positioned herself for the best lighting on Jake's face. Miguel monitored the live stream numbers, which were already climbing as word spread through social media that Jake Morrison was about to attempt something dramatic at Buckingham Palace. Jake started small, as he always did. Standing just outside the designated tourist area, he began making jokes about British stereotypes, speaking loudly enough for the guard to hear clearly while making exaggerated gestures for his camera. The content was mildly irreverent but nothing that crossed any serious lines. It was standard influencer behavior, the kind of thing that happened dozens of times every day at major tourist attractions around the world. The guard showed no reaction whatsoever. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, his posture perfect, his expression completely neutral. It was exactly what Jake had expected, but it also confirmed that this would be a worthy challenge. Making this professional soldier break character would require real creativity and escalating boldness. Jake moved closer to the barriers, positioning himself directly in the guard's line of sight while continuing his commentary for the camera. He began asking the guard direct questions, speaking as if expecting answers while knowing none would come. How long have you been standing there, mate? Don't your feet hurt in those boots? What happens if you need to use the bathroom? The questions generated laughs from the growing crowd of tourists who had noticed Jake's professional filming setup and recognized him from his social media presence. Several people began taking their own photos and videos of Jake's interaction with the guard, creating the kind of organic audience participation that always boosted engagement metrics. Still, the guard remained perfectly motionless. Marcus Thompson had heard every variation of these questions thousands of times before. Nothing Jake was saying was original or particularly challenging. Marcus's training had prepared him for far more serious tests of his composure, and dealing with attention-seeking tourists was simply part of his daily routine. Jake recognized that his current approach wasn't generating the dramatic footage his audience expected. The guard's discipline was impressive, but watching someone ignore questions wasn't particularly exciting content. He needed to escalate, to find the line where professionalism met human reaction and push right up against it. The next phase involved Jake moving even closer to the guard's position, technically staying within the allowed tourist areas but pushing the boundaries of what felt respectful. He began making more personal comments, observations about the guard's appearance and speculations about his life outside of his uniform. The tone remained ostensibly playful, but there was an edge of mockery creeping in. "Look at this guy," Jake said to his camera while gesturing toward Marcus. "Standing there like a statue, probably thinking about his girlfriend or what he's having for dinner. I bet he's dying to move, dying to scratch his nose or adjust his hat. But he can't, because that's not what good little soldiers do, right?" The crowd around Jake was growing larger, drawn by the professional filming equipment and the promise of witnessing some kind of confrontation. Many were taking their own photos and videos, creating multiple angles of documentation that Jake knew would help spread whatever happened next across social media platforms. The organic audience was exactly what he needed to amplify the reach of his content. Marcus could feel the situation shifting in ways that his training had taught him to recognize. What had started as typical tourist curiosity was becoming something more focused and potentially problematic. The young man with the cameras was clearly building towards something, and his commentary was becoming more personal and less respectful with each passing minute. Palace security had also noticed the change in dynamics. Marcus could see two officers positioning themselves with better views of the situation, and he could hear increased radio traffic in his earpiece. The situation wasn't yet serious enough to require intervention, but it was clearly being monitored more closely than routine tourist interactions. Jake's management team had always counseled him about knowing where lines were drawn, about understanding the difference between bold content and genuinely problematic behavior. But, in the moment, with thousands of people watching his live stream and commenting encouragement for him to push further, those careful distinctions felt less important than delivering the spectacular content his audience expected. The third phase of Jake's escalation involved direct attempts to distract or surprise the guard into breaking character. He began making sudden movements in the guard's peripheral vision, waving his hands and jumping slightly while maintaining a running commentary about testing the guard's training and discipline. It was still technically within the bounds of acceptable tourist behavior, but it was clearly designed to provoke a reaction. Marcus had dealt with this type of testing many times before. His peripheral vision allowed him to track Jake's movements without moving his eyes, and his training had prepared him for far more serious attempts at distraction. The key was maintaining focus on his primary duty while being aware of everything happening around him. Jake's antics were annoying, but they weren't genuinely challenging to someone with Marcus's experience and training. The live stream comments were becoming more aggressive, with viewers pushing Jake to be bolder, to try more dramatic tactics. The peer pressure from his online audience was combining with Jake's own competitive instincts and his professional need to create content that would justify the production costs of his London trip. Jake began to incorporate props into his performance, pulling items from his backpack to use in his attempts to break the guard's composure. A rubber chicken appeared first, held up near the guard's face while Jake made exaggerated chicken noises. When that failed to generate any reaction, he tried a small horn, creating sharp noise bursts while monitoring the guard's face for any sign of annoyance or amusement. Each failed attempt to get a reaction from the guard made Jake more determined and more creative. His audience was loving the content, with live stream numbers climbing and comments flooding in faster than he could read them. The energy was exactly what he had been hoping for, the kind of viral moment that could generate millions of views and keep his brand momentum going strong. Marcus was becoming genuinely annoyed by the escalating disruptions, but his training held firm. He had learned early in his service that reacting to provocations, no matter how irritating, would only encourage more of the same behavior. The best response was no response, maintaining perfect discipline until the disruptive tourist either got bored or was removed by security. Palace security officers were now in closer proximity, clearly prepared to intervene if Jake's behavior crossed from annoying to genuinely disruptive. Their presence was both a warning to Jake and a reassurance to Marcus that help was available if the situation escalated beyond what he could handle through simple discipline and patience. Jake noticed the security officers and recognized that his window for creating dramatic content was starting to narrow. If security intervened now, he would have footage of being removed from a tourist area, which could be embarrassing rather than triumphant. He needed to create the viral moment he was after before external forces shut down his performance. The decision to move into the final phase of his escalation came when Jake saw his live stream numbers peak above 50,000 concurrent viewers. With that large an audience watching in real time, whatever happened next would be documented and shared instantly across multiple platforms. It was the perfect moment for the kind of bold move that had built his career. Jake handed his phone to Lisa so she could capture his face during whatever came next, while Tommy adjusted position to get the best angle on both Jake and the guard. Miguel increased the sensitivity on his audio equipment to catch every word and sound. The professional crew was ready to document whatever Jake was about to do, and the live audience was primed for something spectacular. What Jake did next would change both his life and Marcus's life in ways that neither of them could have imagined. The moment came without warning. Jake Morrison stepped forward and reached up toward Marcus Thompson's bearskin hat with both hands, his fingers making contact with the pristine black fur while his camera crew captured every second. "Let's see what's under this ridiculous thing," Jake announced to his live stream audience, tugging at the hat while grinning directly into Tommy's camera. Time seemed to slow for Marcus. The physical contact was a complete violation of protocol, a breach of respect that crossed every line his training had established. But, more than that, it was an assault on everything the uniform represented. The bearskin hat wasn't just part of his equipment, it was a symbol of centuries of military tradition, of service and sacrifice by thousands of soldiers who had worn it before him. In that split second of contact, Marcus felt something snap inside him. Not anger exactly, but a crystalline clarity about what was happening and what needed to happen next. 6 years of perfect discipline, 6 years of maintaining composure under every imaginable provocation, and this American tourist thought he could just reach out and grab at him like he was a street performer. Marcus's response was swift, professional, and completely unexpected by everyone watching. "Stand back." Marcus roared in his full military voice, a sound trained to carry across battlefields and parade grounds. The volume and authority behind it made everyone within 50 feet freeze instantly. Jake's hands jerked away from the hat as if he'd been electrically shocked. But Marcus wasn't finished. With movements as precise and mechanical as his hours of motionless standing, Marcus brought his rifle from the shoulder arms position to port arms, the weapon held diagonally across his chest in a display that was both ceremonial and unmistakably threatening. His eyes, which had stared straight ahead without focusing on anything for hours, now locked directly onto Jake's face with an intensity that made the young influencer take an involuntary step backward. "You will show proper respect to Her Majesty's Guard," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Step behind the barrier immediately." The crowd that had gathered around Jake's performance fell silent. Tourists who had been laughing and taking photos just moments before now stood in stunned silence, suddenly aware that they were witnessing something far more serious than entertainment. Children moved closer to their parents. Several people began backing away from the immediate area. Jake's mind raced as he tried to process what had just happened. The guard had spoken. More than spoken, he had commanded. And the voice that emerged from beneath the bearskin hat was nothing like the stereotypical British accent Jake had expected. It was pure authority, the voice of someone who had been trained to lead soldiers in life and death situations. Tommy kept filming, his professional instincts overriding any personal discomfort with the situation. This was exactly the kind of dramatic content Jake's audience craved, the moment when careful boundaries collapsed into genuine confrontation. The live stream numbers were climbing rapidly as word spread across social media that something significant was happening at Buckingham Palace. "I was just trying to have some fun," Jake protested, attempting to regain control of the narrative while addressing both the guard and his camera simultaneously. "It's just a hat, mate. No need to get all serious about it." The words were a mistake. Marcus's expression darkened further, if such a thing was possible. "Just a hat," he repeated, his voice dropping to a lower register that somehow carried even more menace than his earlier shout. "This hat represents 200 years of military tradition. It was worn by soldiers who died defending this country while you were still learning to walk." Jake was beginning to realize that he had badly miscalculated the situation. The guard wasn't just angry, he was offended in a way that went far deeper than professional annoyance. This wasn't the kind of reaction that could be laughed off or dismissed as uptight foreign customs. This was personal. Palace security officers were moving quickly toward the confrontation now, speaking rapidly into their radios while positioning themselves to intervene if necessary. But they were also allowing Marcus to handle the immediate situation, recognizing that his authority as a Queen's Guard gave him certain discretionary powers in dealing with disrespectful tourists. Furthermore, Marcus continued, his rifle still held in the port arms position, "You will address me as guard, not mate. I am a serving soldier in Her Majesty's army, not your drinking buddy from university." The crowd around them had grown substantially as word spread through the tourist areas that one of the famously silent guards was speaking, and speaking with considerable force. People were running from other areas of the palace grounds to witness the unprecedented scene, their phones already recording as they arrived. Jake's crew was capturing everything from multiple angles. Lisa had positioned herself to get reaction shots from the crowd, while Miguel was recording audio that picked up not just the confrontation but the excited whispers and gasps from the growing audience. The production value of what they were capturing was extraordinary, exactly the kind of content that could define an influencer's career. But Jake was starting to sense that this viral moment might not have the positive impact he had anticipated. The guard's response was too genuine, too full of authentic outrage for Jake to dismiss as entertainment. The crowd's reaction was shifting from excitement to something that felt more like disapproval. Several tourists were shaking their heads or making comments about American tourists and their lack of respect. "Look, guard," Jake said, emphasizing the title with slight mockery, "I apologize if I offended you. But, you have to admit, this is all a bit ridiculous. Standing here all day in a costume, pretending to be a toy soldier for tourists to take pictures with. I was just trying to inject some reality into the whole performance." It was another mistake. The word costume hit Marcus like a physical blow. The uniform he wore had been earned through years of training, selection processes that eliminated more candidates than they accepted, and service that demanded everything he had to give. Calling it a costume reduced everything he had worked for to a theatrical performance. Costume? Marcus repeated, his voice now carrying a dangerous edge that made several tourists in the front of the crowd take steps backward. This uniform represents service to crown and country. These medals were earned through deployment to Afghanistan. This rifle is the weapon I carried through combat operations where better men than you gave their lives for something larger than themselves. Jake was genuinely shocked by the personal nature of the guard's response. He had expected either continued silence or perhaps a brief, professional request to step back. He hadn't anticipated this level of personal engagement, this obvious depth of emotion and commitment. The man underneath the uniform was clearly far more complex and substantial than Jake's assumptions had allowed for. The live stream comments were exploding with reactions from viewers around the world. Many were expressing support for the guard, criticizing Jake for his disrespectful behavior and praising the soldier's dignified response. But others were encouraging Jake to push further, to turn the confrontation into the kind of spectacle that could generate millions of views and months of discussion across social media platforms. Security officers were now close enough to intervene directly, but they were holding back, allowing Marcus to handle the situation according to his judgment. The guards were given considerable latitude in dealing with tourists, and Marcus's response, while unusual, was still within the bounds of acceptable conduct for someone whose primary duty was protecting the dignity and security of the palace. Marcus could feel the weight of centuries of tradition behind him. Every guard who had stood at these gates, every soldier who had worn this uniform, every man who had dedicated his life to service greater than personal ambition seemed to be standing with him in this moment. Jake's casual disrespect wasn't just an insult to Marcus personally, it was an insult to everyone who had served before him. "You came here today thinking you could make me dance for your amusement," Marcus continued, his voice now carrying a controlled fury that was somehow more intimidating than shouting. "You thought I was a prop for your entertainment, something to be touched and manipulated for the amusement of strangers on the internet." Jake tried to interrupt, to regain control of the situation that was spiraling far beyond what he had anticipated. "Hey, that's not what I am not finished," Marcus cut him off with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The interruption had been swift and final, leaving Jake with no choice but to wait for permission to speak. "You represent everything that is wrong with your generation's relationship to service and sacrifice," Marcus continued. "You see something larger than yourselves, something that requires discipline and dedication, and your first instinct is to mock it, to reduce it to content for social media consumption." The crowd was completely silent now, mesmerized by the unexpected eloquence and passion of the guard's response. Many were recording on their phones, but the atmosphere had shifted from entertainment to something approaching solemnity. This wasn't funny anymore, it was a genuine clash between two completely different worldviews. Jake's management team had always warned him about the possibility of encountering someone who wouldn't play along with his content creation, someone who would respond to his provocations with genuine anger rather than embarrassed silence. But he had never imagined anything like this articulate, passionate defense of principles he barely understood. "Sir," one of the approaching security officers called out, addressing Marcus rather than Jake, "is assistance required?" Marcus considered the question for a moment, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. The influencer looked genuinely shaken now, his earlier confidence replaced by something approaching humility. The viral moment he had been seeking was definitely happening, but not in the way he had intended. "No assistance required," Marcus replied to the security officer while maintaining eye contact with Jake. This young man was just leaving. He has footage for his internet followers, and I believe he has learned something about respect. Jake realized that he was being dismissed, that the guard was offering him an opportunity to leave the situation with some dignity intact. The alternative, he was beginning to understand, might involve palace security and potentially more serious consequences than embarrassment on social media. "Yeah," Jake said quietly, his earlier bravado completely gone. "Yeah, we're leaving." He turned to his crew, gesturing for them to pack up their equipment. Tommy lowered his camera for the first time since the confrontation began. Lisa and Miguel began gathering their gear with unusual efficiency, all three of them recognizing that it was time to exit the situation as quickly as possible. But, as Jake began to move away from Marcus's position, he couldn't resist one final attempt to regain some control over the narrative. Turning back toward the guard while his camera was still rolling, he spoke directly to his live stream audience. "Well, there you have it, folks. The famous British politeness in action. I guess some people just can't handle a little harmless fun." It was his final mistake of the day. Marcus's response was swift and final. There was nothing harmless about disrespecting this uniform or the men who died wearing it. Your fun came at the expense of honoring their sacrifice. That is something a man of character would never do. The words hit Jake like a physical blow, delivered with such quiet dignity and conviction that arguing seemed impossible. Around them, the crowd had begun to disperse, but many were still recording the aftermath of the confrontation on their phones. As Jake and his crew finally moved away from the palace gates, Marcus returned to his position of attention, his rifle back at shoulder arms, his eyes once again focused straight ahead. Within moments, he appeared to be the same motionless, silent guard who had been standing there all day. But something fundamental had changed. In the space of 5 minutes, Marcus Thompson had become more than just another anonymous Queen's Guard. He had become a symbol of dignity, respect, and the timeless values that military service represented. And Jake Morrison had become something else entirely. Within 30 minutes of Jake Morrison leaving Buckingham Palace, the first videos began appearing online. Tommy had uploaded the raw footage to Jake's YouTube channel while they sat in a nearby cafe, still processing what had happened. The video was titled "Queen's Guard Loses It on American Tourist," with a thumbnail showing Marcus mid-shout, his face contorted with authority and anger. It was exactly the kind of sensational presentation that Jake's audience expected, but, watching the footage back, Jake felt uneasy about how he appeared in the interaction. The video caught fire immediately. Within the first hour, it had generated 50,000 views and hundreds of comments. But, the response wasn't what Jake had anticipated. Instead of praising his boldness or laughing at the guard's reaction, the comments were overwhelmingly critical of Jake's behavior. Finally, someone put this entitled American in his place. That guard showed more class in 5 minutes than this YouTuber has in his entire career. Imagine thinking you can just touch a soldier and not face consequences. This is exactly why people hate American tourists. The sentiment was consistent across platforms. When the video spread to Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok through shares and clips, the reaction remained the same. Jake had expected to be celebrated as someone who had successfully provoked a reaction from one of the world's most disciplined soldiers. Instead, he was being portrayed as a disrespectful tourist who had been appropriately corrected by a professional doing his job. Marcus Thompson, meanwhile, had no idea that his life was about to change completely. He finished his shift at 6 o'clock, following the same routine he had maintained for 6 years. The changing of the guard ceremony proceeded normally, with Marcus handing over his position to the evening guard with the precision and ceremony that tourists gathered to witness every day. To everyone watching, he appeared to be the same perfectly disciplined soldier who had been standing motionless for hours. But Marcus could feel the difference. The confrontation with Jake had affected him in ways he was still processing. For years, he had prided himself on never breaking character, never allowing tourists to provoke any reaction from him. Today, he had not just reacted, he had engaged in a full verbal confrontation that multiple people had recorded on their phones. As Marcus changed out of his uniform back at the barracks, Sergeant Williams approached him with an expression that mixed concern with curiosity. "Thompson, I need to speak with you about the incident this afternoon," the sergeant said quietly. "There's been some chatter on social media, and the brass wants to understand exactly what happened." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He had known that his reaction to Jake would likely result in some form of official attention, but he had hoped it might be handled quietly within the regiment. The mention of social media suggested that the situation might be larger than he had anticipated. "What kind of chatter, Sergeant?" Marcus asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "Video footage. Multiple angles. Apparently, this American tourist was live streaming when you had your interaction with him. The whole thing is online now, and it's spreading fast." Marcus closed his eyes briefly, imagining the footage of his outburst being watched by thousands of strangers around the world. The thought made him feel simultaneously embarrassed and defensive. He wasn't sorry for standing up to Jake's disrespectful behavior, but he was concerned about how his superiors would view his departure from standard protocol. "Am I in trouble, sir?" Marcus asked directly. Sergeant Williams paused, considering his response carefully. "That remains to be seen, Thompson." The initial reaction from the chain of command is mixed. Some feel you violated protocol by engaging with a disruptive tourist instead of letting security handle it. Others think you showed appropriate respect for the uniform and the service. Marcus nodded, accepting that his fate would be determined by people who hadn't been there, who hadn't felt the casual disrespect of Jake's hands on his bearskin hat or heard the dismissive tone when he called the uniform a costume. "For now," Sergeant Williams continued, "you're to report for normal duties tomorrow while the matter is under review. But, Thompson, I'd suggest you prepare yourself for significant attention. This video is spreading fast, and the public reaction is intense." Marcus left the barracks that evening with his mind racing. His dinner plans with Sarah suddenly felt both more important and more complicated than they had that morning. The simple proposal he had been planning would now take place against the backdrop of whatever was happening online with the video of his confrontation. He took the tube to Covent Garden, checking his phone during the journey and immediately regretting it. His name was already appearing in search results, connected to headlines about Queen's Guard confronts disrespectful tourist and British soldier puts American YouTuber in his place. The coverage seemed positive, but the scale was overwhelming. Sarah was waiting for him at their favorite restaurant, her face showing a mixture of excitement and concern that told Marcus she had already seen something online. "Marcus," she said as he approached their table, "your video is everywhere. My entire Twitter feed is nothing but clips of you telling off that American tourist." Marcus sat down heavily, suddenly, feeling exhausted by a day that had started so normally and become so complicated. "What are people saying?" Sarah pulled out her phone, scrolling through the responses she had been monitoring for the past hour. "It's incredible, actually. I've never seen anything like it. People are calling you a hero, praising you for standing up to disrespectful behavior and defending British traditions." She showed Marcus her screen, scrolling through dozens of tweets praising his response to Jake's behavior. Comments from military veterans, British citizens living abroad, and people from around the world who admired his articulate defense of service and tradition. "Look at this one," Sarah said, pointing to a tweet with thousands of likes. That guard's response was poetry. Calm, dignified, and absolutely devastating. This is what real authority looks like. Marcus read through several of the comments, amazed by the overwhelmingly positive response. He had expected criticism, possible disciplinary action, and embarrassment about losing his composure. Instead, he was being praised for exactly the qualities his military training had instilled in him: dignity, respect, and unwavering commitment to something larger than himself. "There's more," Sarah continued, switching to Instagram. "Someone made a compilation video of different angles of your confrontation. It has over 1 million views already, and the comments are incredible. People are saying you restored their faith in military professionalism." Marcus watched a minute-long compilation that someone had created using footage from multiple tourist phones. Seeing the confrontation from different angles, he was struck by how controlled and professional his response had been, even in the moment of his greatest anger. His voice never broke, his posture remained perfect, and his arguments were articulated clearly despite his obvious emotion. "What about the American?" Marcus asked. "What are people saying about him?" Sarah's expression darkened slightly. "It's not good for him. People are really angry about his behavior. The comments on his original video are brutal, and it spread to all his other social media. His sponsors are getting tagged in posts criticizing his disrespectful behavior." She showed Marcus some of the responses to Jake's content. The influencer was being criticized not just for the specific incident at Buckingham Palace, but for representing a broader cultural problem of disrespect and entitlement. military families, British citizens, and people who valued tradition were expressing genuine anger at his casual dismissal of Marcus's service and sacrifice. Some of the brands that sponsor him are already distancing themselves, Sarah continued. There's a whole thread about companies that shouldn't associate with someone who disrespects military service. Marcus felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and concern. He was gratified that people understood and supported his reaction, but he was also aware that Jake's life was being significantly impacted by their brief confrontation. The influencer had been disrespectful and deserved to be corrected, but Marcus wondered if the online response was becoming disproportionate to the offense. As they ordered dinner, Marcus's phone began buzzing with notifications. Friend requests, messages from reporters, and interview requests from media outlets that had picked up the story. The quiet evening he had planned was clearly not going to happen. Sarah, Marcus said, looking across the table at the woman he loved, I had something important I wanted to ask you tonight, but I'm not sure this is the right time anymore. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. Marcus Thompson, if you think some viral video is going to change how I feel about you, you're crazy. Ask me whatever you want to ask me. Marcus felt his resolve strengthen. The day had been unlike any other in his life, but the most important thing hadn't changed. He loved Sarah, he wanted to build a life with her, and no amount of internet fame or controversy was going to alter that fundamental truth. By the time they finished dinner, Marcus's original video had surpassed 2 million views across all platforms. News outlets in the UK, US, and around the world were picking up the story, framing it as everything from British Guard defends national honor to social media influencer learns hard lesson about respect. The story was being discussed on television news programs, radio shows, and podcast programs. Military experts were being interviewed about the significance of Marcus's response, while social media analysts discussed the broader implications of the confrontation between traditional values and influencer culture. Jake Morrison, meanwhile, was experiencing the downside of viral fame for the first time in his career. His social media mentions were overwhelmingly negative, with thousands of people criticizing his behavior and calling for his sponsors to drop him. The video that he had created to generate positive attention and increase his following was instead threatening to destroy the career he had spent years building. By midnight London time, the hashtag #RespectTheGuard was trending worldwide, with hundreds of thousands of posts supporting Marcus's response and criticizing Jake's behavior. Military families were sharing their own stories about the sacrifice and dedication required for military service, while British citizens living abroad were expressing pride in Marcus's dignified defense of their country's traditions. Marcus finally turned off his phone as he and Sarah walked home together, the engagement ring now safely on her finger and their future secured regardless of whatever happened with his unexpected internet fame. The proposal had been everything he had hoped for, made even more meaningful by the day's events that had reminded them both of what truly mattered. But, as Marcus fell asleep that night, he had no idea how completely his life was about to change, or how the 5-minute confrontation with an American tourist would transform him from an anonymous soldier into an international symbol of dignity, respect, and the timeless values that military service represented. The video continued spreading throughout the night, shared across time zones and cultures, resonating with anyone who had ever felt that respect and tradition were under assault in an increasingly casual world. By morning, Marcus Thompson would wake up as one of the most famous soldiers in the world, and Jake Morrison would wake up to discover that internet fame could be as destructive as it was profitable. Marcus Thompson woke up to his phone buzzing incessantly at 5 in the morning. Before he was fully conscious, he was answering call after call from numbers he didn't recognize, each one representing a journalist, talk show producer, or media outlet wanting to interview the Queen's Guard who had gone viral defending British honor. Sarah sat up in bed beside him, rubbing her eyes as Marcus's phone continued its relentless buzzing. The engagement ring on her finger caught the early morning light streaming through their bedroom window, a reminder of the perfect evening that had emerged from such an unexpected day. How many missed calls do you have? Sarah asked, peering at Marcus's phone screen. Marcus scrolled through his notifications with growing amazement. 47 missed calls, over 300 text messages, and... He paused, checking his social media accounts for the first time since the previous evening. Holy Christ! The video of his confrontation with Jake Morrison had exploded beyond anything he could have imagined. The original footage now had over 15 million views across all platforms. Compilation videos, reaction videos, and news segments about the incident were generating millions of additional views. Marcus's name was trending worldwide, accompanied by hashtags like #RespectTheGuard, #BritishPride, and #RealHero. More importantly, the global conversation had evolved far beyond simple entertainment. Military veterans from around the world were sharing their own stories about the importance of respecting service and tradition. Parents were using the video as a teaching moment about dignity and respect. Educators were discussing the broader cultural implications of the confrontation between traditional values and social media culture. Marcus's phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Palace Communications Office. Thompson speaking, Marcus answered, his military training taking over despite the surreal circumstances. Guardsman Thompson, this is Colonel Patricia Harrington from Palace Communications. I need you to report to my office immediately for a briefing about your current media situation. This is a matter of some urgency. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. A summons from Palace Communications suggested that his confrontation with Jake had attracted attention at the highest levels of the royal household. This could mean anything from commendation to court-martial, and Marcus had no idea which direction his superiors were leaning. Yes, ma'am. I'll be there within the hour. Actually, Thompson, you'll need to use the rear entrance. There are approximately 50 journalists and camera crews at the main gate, all asking for you by name. Marcus looked out his bedroom window and saw 3 news vans parked on his normally quiet street, with reporters and camera operators setting up equipment on the sidewalk. His personal address had somehow been discovered and shared online, turning his private life into public spectacle overnight. The journey to the palace required careful coordination with security personnel to avoid the growing media presence. Marcus wore civilian clothes and kept his head down, but photographers still managed to capture images of him entering the palace through service entrances normally reserved for staff and deliveries. Colonel Harrington was a small, precise woman with 20 years of experience managing communications between the royal household and the international media. Her office walls were covered with photographs from state visits, royal weddings, and ceremonial events she had helped coordinate. She looked up as Marcus entered, her expression unreadable. Sit down, Thompson. We need to discuss your immediate future. Marcus took the offered chair, his mind racing through possible outcomes. Disciplinary action for breaking protocol, dismissal from the guards, or perhaps exile to some remote posting where his newfound fame wouldn't be a distraction. First, Colonel Harrington began, you should know that your conduct yesterday has been reviewed at the highest levels. Your response to that tourist's disrespectful behavior was appropriate, proportionate, and reflective of the values we expect from Her Majesty's Guards. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. Thank you, ma'am. However, she continued, your current media profile presents unique challenges. You are now, whether you intended it or not, an international symbol. The video of your confrontation has been viewed by more than 50 million people worldwide. You represent not just yourself or even the guards, but British values and military professionalism to a global audience. She turned her computer monitor toward Marcus, showing him a compilation of news coverage from around the world. BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, and dozens of other networks had covered the story. Military experts were praising his restraint and professionalism. Cultural commentators were discussing the broader implications of his defense of tradition and respect. The question, Colonel Harrington continued, is how we manage this attention in a way that serves both your interests and the interests of the crown. Marcus had been so focused on potential punishment that he hadn't considered the possibility of his viral fame being treated as an opportunity rather than a crisis. What are you proposing, ma'am? We've received requests from over 200 media outlets for interviews with you. Talk shows, news programs, documentary projects, and even film studios interested in your story. Normally, serving members of the Guards don't engage with media, but your situation is unprecedented. She handed Marcus a thick folder filled with interview requests, appearance offers, and what appeared to be contract proposals from entertainment companies. The decision is ultimately yours, Thompson. You can return to normal duties and let the media attention fade naturally, which it eventually will. Or you can engage selectively with media that aligns with the values you represented yesterday. Marcus opened the folder, amazed by the scope of interest his 5-minute confrontation had generated. Major television networks wanted him for primetime interviews. Publishers were offering book deals. Even Hollywood agents were expressing interest in his story rights. "What would you recommend, ma'am?" Colonel Harrington smiled slightly, the first time her professional demeanor had cracked since Marcus entered her office. "I think you have an opportunity to represent military service and British values to a global audience in ways that could have lasting positive impact. But only if you do it right." They spent the next 2 hours developing a media strategy that would allow Marcus to share his message about respect, service, and tradition while protecting his privacy and maintaining his military career. Selective interviews with respected journalists, appearances at military and veteran events, and partnerships with organizations that supported military families and traditional values. Meanwhile, Jake Morrison was experiencing the opposite trajectory. The influencer had spent a sleepless night watching his social media empire crumble in real time. 3 major sponsors had already canceled their contracts, citing concerns about associating their brands with disrespectful behavior toward military personnel. His management team was fielding dozens of calls from angry business partners and potential collaborators who no longer wanted to work with him. The comment sections on all of Jake's content had become hostile territory. Years of carefully cultivated social media presence were being overwhelmed by criticism of his behavior at Buckingham Palace. His follower count was dropping rapidly as people shared their disgust with his treatment of Marcus and what he represented. Jake had issued several apology videos throughout the night, each one receiving more criticism than the last. His attempts to explain his behavior as harmless fun or cultural misunderstanding were met with ridicule from an audience that had seen through his excuses. The articulate dignity of Marcus's response made Jake's behavior appear even more juvenile and disrespectful by comparison. By afternoon, Jake's talent agency had dropped him as a client. The statement was brief but devastating. "We no longer represent Mr. Morrison due to conduct that conflicts with our company values regarding respect for military service and national traditions." The financial impact was immediate and severe. Sponsorship deals worth hundreds of thousands of dollars were canceled. Planned collaboration projects were put on indefinite hold. The London trip that was supposed to generate months of profitable content had instead destroyed the career Jake had spent years building. Marcus, meanwhile, was discovering what positive viral fame felt like. His first television interview was with BBC News, conducted by a veteran journalist who had covered military affairs for 20 years. The conversation focused on Marcus's background, his military service, and his thoughts about the importance of respecting tradition and service. "When that young man put his hands on your hat," the interviewer asked, "what went through your mind?" Marcus considered the question carefully, aware that millions of people would see his response. "I thought about every soldier who had worn that uniform before me, sir. Men who had served in conflicts I can barely imagine, who had maintained these traditions through world wars and peacekeeping missions. That hat isn't just part of my equipment, it represents a continuity of service that stretches back centuries." The interview was watched by 8 million people in the UK alone, with millions more viewing clips online. Marcus's thoughtful, articulate responses generated widespread praise from viewers who found his perspective refreshing in an era of social media superficiality. Veterans organizations began reaching out to Marcus, inviting him to speak at events and represent military values to civilian audiences. Military families sent letters thanking him for defending the dignity of service. Schools requested visits from him to discuss respect, tradition, and the importance of something larger than individual ambition. Sarah watched the coverage from their flat, amazed by how completely their lives had changed in just 48 hours. The man she had agreed to marry was now being discussed on international news programs as a symbol of dignity and traditional values. Their engagement, which should have been a private celebration, was being reported by entertainment news outlets as a feel-good epilogue to the viral video story. "Are you okay with all this?" Marcus asked her during a brief break between media appearances. Sarah took his hand, looking at the engagement ring that had been given during such extraordinary circumstances. "I'm proud of you, Marcus. You stood up for something important, and people around the world are responding to that. Just don't let it change who you are." The contrast between Marcus's and Jake's experiences crystallized the broader cultural conversation that the video had sparked. Marcus represented dignity, service, and respect for tradition. Jake represented entitlement, disrespect, and the worst aspects of social media culture. The global response to their confrontation revealed how hungry people were for authentic examples of character and principle. 6 months later, Marcus was still serving as a Queen's Guard, but his role had expanded significantly. He had become an unofficial ambassador for military values, speaking at schools, veteran events, and cultural institutions about the importance of service and respect. His book, Standing Guard, Tradition, Service, and Honor in Modern Britain, became a bestseller, with proceeds going to military charities. Jake Morrison had largely disappeared from social media, his career never recovering from the backlash to his behavior at Buckingham Palace. The incident had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of pushing boundaries for content, and about the real-world consequences of disrespecting values that others held sacred. Marcus and Sarah married the following year in a ceremony that was covered respectfully by media outlets around the world. Veterans from multiple countries attended, celebrating not just their union but what Marcus had come to represent, the enduring importance of honor, service, and respect in an increasingly casual world. The 5-minute confrontation that had started as Jake's attempt to create viral content had indeed changed both their lives forever. But the lasting impact was exactly the opposite of what Jake had intended. Instead of humiliating a traditional institution, he had inadvertently created a global platform for the values that institution represented. Marcus continued to serve at Buckingham Palace, standing guard with the same perfect discipline he had maintained for years. But now, tourists approached with greater respect, children asked their parents serious questions about military service, and people from around the world traveled to London specifically to see the guard who had become a symbol of dignity in an undignified age. The bearskin hat that Jake had so casually grabbed sat exactly where it belonged, atop the head of a man who understood what it meant to serve something larger than himself. And Marcus Thompson, the Yorkshire working-class kid who had found his calling in military service, continued to stand perfectly still while representing the timeless values that no amount of social media fame could diminish or destroy. The moment of disrespect had become a moment of renewal, reminding the world that some things remain sacred, some traditions deserve protection, and some men will always be willing to stand guard over what matters most.